Hi, and welcome back. Regular viewers of this channel will know that I was a live sound engineer for a long time before I made the switch to the studio. When I started out, the consoles were all analogue, and the front-of-house rack would be loaded with analogue gates and compressors and analogue graphic EQ. There were usually a handful of digital units in the rack, however, for effects like reverb or delay. But you might be surprised to learn that Lexicon reverbs usually didn't feature. Among live sound engineers, those units were not popular at all, with a reputation for being difficult to program. When you're under the time pressure of a soundcheck, you can't be hunting through menus of obscurely named parameters, trying and failing to find something called reverb time or similar. So the only real option was to pick a preset that was close enough and make do with it. There was, however, one notable exception. The PCM60 was the only Lexicon reverb that was prized by the front-of-house people, given that it just had 4 buttons each for size and decay time, plus a choice of room or plate algorithms. This one let you dial in your reverb in seconds, then move on, and personally I was always happy to find one in the rack. You can't see me, but know that I'll be doing air quotes every time I say the word plate in this review. More on that shortly. Anyway, reverb is rather more important in the studio, so there may be times when you're grateful for the deep control that you get on the bigger Lexicon units. But equally, many times, maybe most of the time, all you want to do is add some nice sounding space. The PCM60 lets you do that quickly and easily without bogging you down in unnecessary complexity. And I would argue that speed and efficiency are almost as important in the studio as they are for live sound. Enter the Betamaker BM60. The top half of this looks very familiar indeed, and there's little doubt what hardware this is based on. The bottom section adds a handful of welcome extra features, with pre-delay being perhaps the most important, although it seems to me there's room for a couple more, which I'll come to shortly. Now, there is an interesting extra question that arises when plugins are modelling vintage digital hardware rather than vintage analogue hardware. Digital units, however vintage, had an algorithm and code to implement it. Did the developers have access to the original code so they could port it to a new platform? Or was it reverse engineered through testing and measurement to create something very similar, but probably not identical? Two things make me think it's probably the latter. First of all, if they don't have legal rights to use the Lexicon or PCM60 names, I'm guessing they also don't have legal rights to use the code. And second, when Softube released their Weiss plugins, they were very keen to tell everyone that they had indeed ported the original code, and the plugins should therefore sound identical to the hardware. I see no mention of that in the BM60 marketing. It's difficult for me to comment on how accurately they've modelled the reverb, given that the last time I can remember using a real PCM60 was back in 2008, and that was in an echoey venue rather than a well-behaved control room. But they've definitely nailed the user experience. You can dial in a suitable reverb in seconds, and 90% of the time you don't really need any more control than this gives you. I would say they've also got that characteristic Lexicon sound down nicely. The reverbs don't sound particularly impressive in isolation. We have modern reverbs that can simulate real rooms much more convincingly, or create much more complex, abstract spaces. What I've always liked about the Lexicon algorithms is the way the reverb seems to become a part of the sound, rather than just being slapped on top. It's a very vague and nebulous description, I know, sorry about that. There's just something nice about the way they blend with and embiggen the dry sound. This little mix I've put together uses only 2 instances, both on sends. Back in the 80s, a studio might have only had 2 reverbs available, so I've lent into that with 1 short setting and 1 longer, and everything's ending to one or the other or both. Listen to what happens when I mute the return channels. Most of this plugin is fairly self-explanatory, which is kind of the point really. There are a few things that can be helpfully pointed out, however. First of all, look at the wet-only output on an analyzer. There's nothing above about 10k, suggesting the reverb is generated with a lower than standard sample rate. That's pretty unsurprising for a vintage reverb. But notice that if I crossfade to the dry signal, we're full bandwidth again. So your dry signal won't get band limited in the same way if you use this as an insert effect, and you won't lose any of that content above 10k. You might in fact gain extra content above 10k because the dry signal is affected by the input stage saturation. It stays pretty clean until you get the red light at the top of the meter, and then kicks in fairly hard. And no, there's no oversampling and it does alias. I'm not too concerned about this, to be honest, though. A bit of aliasing feeding a reverb might actually be a good thing. If you want only that, you can press the bypass button, which turns off the reverb but not the saturation. Unlike the power switch over to the right, which bypasses everything. This still leaves the bypass button a little bit redundant, given that it seems to be identical to just setting the mix knob all dry, but never mind. Next, the contour buttons on the right are less self-explanatory than most of the other controls. Both affect the decay time in different ways. The low contour makes low frequencies decay more slowly, making for a warmer, bigger, more impressive sounding space. While the high contour makes the high frequencies decay faster, making for a darker sound. That last option is the only one where I feel the lack of control quite keenly. There's a pretty huge difference when I toggle this option, and it would be nice to be able to split the difference. I think this option would work better as a continuous control. While I recognise that the marketing department would never allow that button to be replaced with a knob, it seems to me there's plenty of room for a knob in that bottom section, which could adjust how much damping is applied when it's turned on. Alright, let's talk about plates. Those digital effects units I grew up using invariably had settings or presets called plate. These tended to be bright and glossy, sometimes a bit metallic, and usually nothing at all like a real plate. Honestly, I was a bit shocked the first time I heard what an actual real plate sounds like. It's not remotely the same. Listen to this plate on a snare drum. Now compare it to my favourite real plate emulation, UVI plate. Not even close, right? The contour buttons help a bit, but we're still worlds apart. So just be aware that there are plate emulations, and then there are vintage digital reverb plate settings, and they're not really related at all. I've only really got a couple of criticisms of the sound. The plate algorithm, with the smallest room size and the shortest reverb time, results in a slightly lumpy stereo image that tends to pull to the left. That goes away with the next size up. Or the second shortest reverb time. And it doesn't seem to be an issue with the room algorithm. I had a fairly strong preference for the room algorithm in this mix, for both long and short settings. Your mileage may vary. My second slight criticism is many of the settings combinations create quite unnaturally wide stereo images, which does help to create a sense of width and space, but it means the reverb will get a lot quieter in mono, so you might end up with the mono down mix seeming too dry. Fortunately, we have an added stereo width control in the bottom section. I'm going to be turning this down a lot more often than I turn it up. And especially with the super wide settings, you'll probably need to turn up the reverb level to compensate when you do that. While we're on the bottom section, we also have a mono maker, which is a high-pass filter for the side channel, to make sure low bass frequencies stay mono. This option confuses me a little bit. I'm usually not concerned with my reverb having mono subs, because my reverb usually doesn't have any subs at all. Surely just a simple high-pass filter would be more useful here. And why not throw in a low-pass while you're at it? It's not a big deal, as I routinely load an EQ after the reverb anyway, but if you're going to add some extra filtering options, I'd say start with basic high and low pass. And for stereo width options, I honestly think the high frequencies would be a more important target. I find a high frequency mono maker that applied opposing shelves for mid and side more useful, like this setting in Pro Q3. The ducking over to the right is welcome and seems to work well. This ducks the wet reverb signal when there's dry signal present. Generally speaking, it works better when you have a single source feeding the reverb, so I didn't use it in the example mix where everything was sharing 2 instances. Note there's an easy-to-miss option to duck from RMS levels instead of peak levels up at the top left here. Having it built in is helpful for 2 reasons. You can get this type of effect going without having to mess about with sidechain routing for a ducking plugin, and you can dial in ducking when you're running the plugin as an insert, unlike the traditional method which will only work for a send effect. And for exactly the same reasons, it would have been helpful to have a simple gate built in as well. This is a very 80s reverb, after all, and it works very well for gated reverb effects. I reckon there's room to squeeze something in down here, no? One last thing before I go. I was confused when I read the marketing blurb to see that apparently the plugin included an IR loader and a collection of impulses. This surprised me, because it seems a slightly random thing to throw into a vintage reverb emulation, and more to the point, I'd been using the plugin for some time already without finding any such option. Well, I still can't find that option, or any mention of it in the manual either. So I'm forced to conclude this is just erroneous marketing blurb, which should probably be corrected. If I'm wrong, and I've missed a well-hidden feature, let me know in the comments and I'll be sure to make an update video. Alright, that will do. I found more to say about this than I expected to. But I enjoyed using this one. I've saved it in a track template, and I expect I'll be using it quite often. Thanks for watching.